Hey, everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and in this, our 24th and final, asterisk for now, session, we're going to discuss the short stories that came in the wake of American Gods. There are two that we'll discuss in the course of this evening, Monarch of the Glen and Black Dog. They're interesting, they're curious, they are themselves, I think, rather fascinating little ideas, which are in some interesting ways connected to the American Gods universe. They are also, I think, arguably, potentially at least standalone short stories, which Gaiman decided to connect back to American Gods because, question mark? There are details layered into these stories, which, having just read them again today and paid probably more attention to them than I have any time since my first reading of these stories, there are details contained within these stories which make me convinced that there is more to Shadow Moon's story than we have yet been told. And Gaiman has confirmed this himself. He has said, no, I would tell you everything about American Gods. I would tell you the Nameless God. I would tell you all of the things that were happening. I would do all of that stuff if I was absolutely convinced that I wasn't going to write another American God story. So it's possible that at some time in the future, we will reconvene for our discussion of American Gods 2 Electric Boogaloo. I can't wait for that day. And I should say right up front, I'm going to talk about this session as though it's the last session in Storms on the Way. It, of course, isn't. We will reconvene next year to talk about season 2 of the TV show. I say next year, it could potentially be early 2019 before Starz gets around to airing the second season of this show. The Starz original series production schedule is crazy and wildly unpredictable, and they only really maintain one original programming slot in their schedule. It's pretty much this, Sunday night slot, and we've got Outlander and we've got other shows that we must deal with. So it's possible that American Gods will be delayed, but when it comes back, I will come back to talk about it, of course. And if Neil Gaiman should deign to write another American Gods novel, I'll come back to talk about that too. You'd better believe that I will. We're 24 sessions deep into a series that was, I think, supposed to last 18 sessions, which doesn't actually sound so bad when I put it like that. But wow, it's been a long trip, and I'm very glad to have discussed this book with you. So this is going to be a little more informal tonight, as you can tell, because there are only 7 people currently watching here in the YouTube chat. It's a Friday evening, for one. I had to squeeze in this extra bonus schedule into the already crowded Point North Media broadcast schedule. So it's a Friday evening, and they're the short stories. And they're short stories which are kind of tough to get hold of and fairly inessential. I mean, I say tough to get hold of. You can buy the Kindle versions of both of these books on Amazon, but you're not likely to have had these stories cross your path unless you went looking for them. And unlike American Gods, of course, these stories have not been huge hits. So we're going to talk about all of that, but we're going to begin with an interesting question, which doesn't, to my mind, have a ready answer. Certainly doesn't have a completely compelling answer. The wonderful Angela Lurie, who can't be with us tonight because she is recovering from surgery, which I'm glad to say went very well, and she's doing just fine. But Angela asked with some insistence, who is the narrator of American Gods? And I talked about this a little bit as we were moving through. I talked about Mr. Ibis's narration, for example. We get this attributed narration during the Coming to America segments, and there are moments in the body of the book when it feels as though we're stepping toward that kind of singular cadence, that singular kind of tone, but those are just fragments. And then there are other moments in the narrative when it feels as though we're getting an intrusion from Neil Gaiman, from the author's voice, because there are some things in there which don't quite sound American, and there are some things in there which feel as though they are more satirically pointed than the rest of the narration. So at first glance, I'm not sure that I know. And I think it behooves us at this point to kind of strip away a lot of the discussion that we've had of American Gods and look at this book structurally. What does this book tell us about its own form and its own text? As discussed, this is a 4-act book. We talked a lot about this last week, or I guess not even last week, on Tuesday, as we discussed what is branded an epilogue, but is clearly a 4th-act internal climax kind of resolution. The 4 acts of American Gods give us an interesting shape to the story as a whole. It certainly suggests, because of the inclusion of that 4th act, that Shadow's ultimate conflict is not with Wednesday, is not with Loki, is not even with the realm of gods. This isn't a man versus the supernatural story. Shadow's antagonist, Shadow's bête noire, the force which dogs Shadow's steps as he moves through this story, seems to be Shadow. I mean, there is some intrusion, of course, from Wednesday. Wednesday is responsible for Shadow going to prison in the first place, arguably, is certainly responsible for the death of Laura, is responsible for everything that happens to Shadow after he goes to prison, presumably up to and including the introduction of the coin tricks and Herodotus. But Shadow's real problem, or at least the conflict which is resolved in the span of American Gods, is about Shadow's identity. And thus, it can be somewhat frustrating when we move into Monarch of the Glen and we find a Shadow who is very, very familiar. He is a Shadow who is still rootless, still homeless, still errandless. He doesn't really have a place in the world, and he doesn't seem to be moving toward a place with any great rapidity. And we get these notes in Monarch of the Glen of the Vikings who came to Scotland. We get this wonderful line early in the story where we are reminded that the kind of northernmost county of mainland Scotland is known as Sutherland. It is the southern land, but not to anyone in the world save the Vikings. The Vikings came there and they were like, look how far south we are. This is amazing. They came to Scotland and were abandoned there. The people who followed in their footsteps, the people who became Scottish thereafter, abandoned their gods. And those connections have now been severed. And Shadow, in his role as Baldur Odin's son, is a representation of that. He is still an anchor point for that free-floating belief out there in the world, but he can't, or at this point won't, take action. We can't be sure what it is that Shadow is capable of. We can't be sure what it is that Shadow may potentially accomplish, but it is fascinating that the major theme of both of these stories is Shadow getting his crap together, Shadow figuring himself out, at least, or Shadow not getting his crap together, Shadow not figuring himself out. That's a pretty major theme to the dreams in the first story, and then in the second story, Bast explicitly calls him out. She says, this is not where you belong. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be doing this. Who are you? What are you? What are you going to do? And these remain perplexing and perhaps frustratingly unanswered questions at the end of American Gods. So who is narrating this story? Who is telling us this tale? If American Gods has a singular narrator, if apart from the Mr. Ibis sections, there is a singular narrator of American Gods, and this is a named character within the fictional world, if this isn't just a conceit and a concession, if this isn't, standard semi-omniscient third-person narrator guy, this is just effectively Neil Gaiman, this is the author telling us this story. If that's not true, and there certainly seem to be suggestions within the frame of American Gods that that's not entirely true, then we don't know who this person is. I can't think of a single character within the frame of the story, within the frame of the novel, who could be telling us this story with this combination of intimacy and authority. I gotta tell you, right up until the end of the book, there is a major candidate, and that is Laura Moon. But she can't tell us the end of the story, because the point of Laura's story is that her awareness, her existence comes to an end. She would, if that were purposeful, she would not be able to give us an account of the epilogue, for example, those last two chapters set first in Florida and then back in Lakeside. So who narrates American Gods? Well, right now, the best answer we have is Neil Gaiman. The best answer we have is that this is a story in the tradition of stories, that this is almost a kind of oral tradition kind of approach to storytelling, where Gaiman's presence is obscured but still there. It's possible. It's also possible, I suppose, that this is Mr. Ibis, that this is a later Mr. Ibis who is telling us this story, and that he is playfully and self-referentially using his own earlier notes in order to construct an attendant narrative. He has been changed by the God War, by the imminent God War. He has been changed perhaps by his knowledge of Shadow. He has been changed perhaps by some future event of which we are as yet unaware. So he goes back to tell the story of American Gods using himself almost parodically as a counterpoint to his primary narration. That's certainly ambitious and complex enough to satisfy both Mr. Ibis as a character and Neil Gaiman as an author, but I'm not sure that we can be certain of that at this point. So the narrator of American Gods, and coincidentally, perhaps the narrator of these two short stories, remains a little obscured. I'm not at all sure who is telling this story. Can we say for sure that it isn't Shadow? Yes, I think we can say for sure that it isn't Shadow. Or if it is Shadow, it is a Shadow from a point after which his a point after his moment of resolution, whatever that moment of resolution looks like, that moment of integration. This is a shadow post-becoming who must be narrating this story. And even then, I would expect a little more in the way of personal insight and a little less in the way of Rye aside. Shadow, unless he fundamentally changes, isn't really given to Rye asides. So, Angela, I'm sorry. I'm not sure that there's a super satisfying answer, but there it is. There it is. Becca says, I like the thought that Mr. Ibis is at times dictating or retelling other characters' thoughts. I like that too. And Skipa says, if it were Ibis, it could also stumble into non-American idioms and such. That's also potentially true. Yeah. And we should note, of course, just bracket this entire conversation with the clarification that most novels, most third-person novels, don't address the notion of a narrator. This is just a conceit of the novel form since the, 18th century. Ever since, third-person novels really began to take off, and we were no longer anchored in either, the epistolary form or in one character's personal account or some kind of very present narration that frames, the material as a faux historical report or a journal of some kind, the Swiftian approach, the Defoean approach. Ever since we kind of got to the idea that actually third person can just exist on its own, many, many novels in the English language have failed to address the question of a narrator, and that's not a flaw. It is simply a conceit. It is simply a kind of, it's a concession to the reader. This is the form. Don't question this thing over here. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, why, if you're watching a stage play, do all the actors face in the same direction when they're giving their lines? Well, that's not really a part of the internal fiction. That's a part of the production itself. Don't think about that too much. Who printed this book? Who printed, your copy of Pride and Prejudice on the shelf? Well, that's not a part of the fictional frame, actually. So that stories which do engage with that meaningfully within the fictional frame are still the minority. And I'm using kind of evocative language here, fail to engage or are still the minority, but that's not to suggest that the use of this disembodied third-person narrator is in any way a flaw in the fiction. It's just a conceit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't worthy of scrutiny, particularly when you're dealing with the work of a writer as talented and as unorthodox as Neil Gaiman clearly is. Yeah. Was the whole point, asks Becca, of low-key being Shadow's cellmate a way to control his prison experience? Yes, I would argue that it has two purposes. One is to control Shadow's experience, and the other is to kind of check Shadow out. Is he the guy? Wednesday says this explicitly toward the end of the book. This is, a way of keeping tabs on him and a way of investigating him, from a fairly intimate perspective. So that's why Loki is in prison there. Yeah. Daniel said, my husband, after years of me bugging him, is just now reading the book, trying to keep him away. They don't address it, and I think assigning those idioms to Ibis and not Gaiman may be too generous. Maybe a little too generous. It may be Gaiman just slipping up a little bit on his perspective, or in terms of his perspective on Americana and American culture. Yeah. Good. Okay, let's get into our discussion then. Monarch of the Glen, the first of the two American short stories, was originally published in 2003 as part of an 11 short story anthology called Legends 2, New Short Stories by the Masters of Modern Fantasy. This was edited by fantasy author Robert Silverberg, of whom you may well have heard, and you guys, check out this list of stories. There is a story called Homecoming by Robin Hobb. There is a story called The Sworn Sword, a novella, in fact, called The Sworn Sword by George R.R. Martin. Don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but he does pretty good work. There's a story called The Yazoo Queen by Orson Scott Card. There's a story called Lord John and the Succubus by Diana Gabaldon of Outlander fame. There's a story called The Book of Changes by Robert Silverberg. The Happiest Dead Boy in the World by Tad Williams. Beyond Between by Anne McCaffrey. The Messenger by Raymond D. Feist. Threshold by Elizabeth Hayden. Monarch of the Glen by Neil Gaiman. And Indomitable by Terry Brooks. That is a pretty good list of fantasy authors, you guys. That is a pretty definitive 2003 list of who was hot in fantasy. This is a surprisingly ambitious anthology, and you should definitely track down a copy if you can. If you can't, then pick up the Gaiman anthology Fragile Things, which was published in 2006, which also includes The Monarch of the Glen, and includes, as I mentioned in the last session, A Study in Emerald, Gaiman's fantastic Sherlock Holmes Cthulhu mythos crossover story. It's fantastic. The anthology actually begins with A Study in Emerald and concludes with Monarch of the Glen, so you can't really go wrong with that. Monarch of the Glen is a very common phrase, I think, in English. It's a very common title. It's a very common kind of reference point for all things Scottish. And it comes from this. Let me share this picture with you. This is an oil on canvas painting of a red deer stag completed by Sir Edwin Landseer in 1851. It was commissioned for the Palace of Westminster. It was in the 19th century one of the most popular paintings in all of Britain. Reproductions sold just through the roof. It made an absolute ton of money. By the mid 20th century, though, it had kind of become a little cliched. It is oftentimes referred to as, the kind of painting that you would see on the lid of a shortbread tin. And I kid you not, my grandmother, when I was growing up, had a shortbread tin full of buttons that had this very picture on it. I remember seeing images of the Monarch of the Glen in popular media, on television, in movies and things like that, and thinking, why do they have a picture of my granny's button tin? Why is that there? I had no idea. It represents, of course, nobility. It is the romanticization of Scotland. It is the depiction of Scotland which is most favorable in that kind of mid-19th century, kind of almost quasi-pre-industrial. Basically, Scottish history has this lovely period between between the American Revolution, really after the War of Independence. So you're talking about, the late 19th century, the late 18th century there, excuse me. And then kind of by the time we hit industrialization and Victoriana, Scotland has kind of started to slip again. But for about 80 years there, Scotland is super romantic to the English, who are, of course, the dominant force in pop culture at the time. So this depiction of Scotland is completely traditional, completely appropriate for that period. This is representative of all of those impulses towards Scotland, virtue and nobility and the untamed wilderness and all of these things. And of course, we mustn't ever forget that we are looking at a landscape that was less than 100 years previously completely ravaged by the English following the failure of the Jacobite uprising. This is a country which is empty, the Highlands in particular, which is empty not because it is a preserved wilderness, not because it is untouched by the ravages of man, but because it was all but claimed and decimated by war. The Highlands at this point had been stripped of farms and holdings, stripped of clan life. So many people, something like 150,000 people had been deported forcibly to the colonies as a part of the Highland clearances. So this is in itself a creation of perhaps the bloodiest period in Scottish history. So I frame all of this to suggest that Gaiman, of course, being very well aware of this, he is using this title, and I'm sure co-opting this image to represent both the natural world, but also the power of a really good story. Why is Scotland the way that it is? Well, it's the blessed realm. It's the luckiest land on earth. It's touched by a silvery sea and a swollen sky. It is, it is a blessed place, kind of. But it is what it is, particularly where Shadow is in this story, right up on the very northwestern tip of Scotland, only because of the long-standing conflict between the Scots and the English. So in The Monarch of the Glen, Shadow is in Scotland, having traveled first to Iceland, as we saw in the last scene of American Gods, and then to Norway, where we learn he's been looking around, investigating his place of birth, kind of trying to refamiliarize himself. And there were a couple of interesting hints and suggestions here about Shadow's connection to Norway, but then to Scotland. While staying near Cape Wrath, the extreme northwestern corner of Scotland, Shadow is recruited as a security guard of sorts at an exclusive nearby party for the wealthy and the influential. Turns out, though, that he is actually there for a more nefarious reason: to fight Grendel, the monster of Beowulf. We're going to talk a little about Beowulf and a little about Grendel later on. But first, we're going to meet Jenny. This is the first slide that I've pulled from Monarch of the Glen. So you like it here? She looked at him and shook her head. I feel like a Huldar. He'd heard the word before in Norway. Aren't they a kind of troll? No, they're mountain creatures, like the trolls, but they come from the woods, and they're very beautiful, like me. She grinned as she said it, and if she knew that she was too pallid, as if she knew she was too pallid, too sulky, and too thin to ever be beautiful. They fall in love with farmers. Why? Damned if I know, she said, but they do. Sometimes the farmer realizes he's talking to a holder woman because she has a cow's tail hanging down behind, or worse, sometimes from behind there's nothing there. She's just hollow and empty like a shell. Then the farmer says a prayer or runs away, flees back to his mother or his farm. But sometimes the farmers do not run. Sometimes they throw a knife over her shoulder or just smile and they marry the holder woman. Then her tail falls off. But she's still stronger than any human woman could ever be, and she still pines for her home in the forests and the mountains. She will never truly be happy. She will never be human. What happens to her then? Asked Shadow. Does she age and die with the farmer? She had sliced the apple down to the core. Now, with a flick of the wrist, she sent the apple core arcing off the side of the hill. When her man dies, I think she goes back to the hills and the woods. She stared out at the hillside. There's a story about one of them who was married to a farmer who didn't treat her well. He shouted at her, wouldn't help around the farm. He came home from the village drunk and angry. Sometimes he beat her. Now, one day she's in the farmhouse, making up the morning's fire, and he comes in and starts shouting at her, for his food is not ready and he is angry. Nothing she does is right. He doesn't know why he married her, and she listens to him for a while, and then, saying nothing, she reaches down into the fireplace, and she picks up the poker, a heavy black iron jobby. She takes that poker, and without an effort, she bends it into a perfect circle, just like her wedding ring. She doesn't grunt or sweat. She just bends it like you'd bend a reed. And her farmer sees this and he goes white as a sheet and doesn't say anything else about his breakfast. He's seen what she did to the poker, and he knows that at any time in the last 5 years she could have done the same to him. And until he died, he never laid another finger on her, never said one harsh word. Now you tell me something, Mr. Everybody Calls You Shadow. If she could do that, why did she let him beat her in the first place? Why would she want to be with someone like that? You tell me. Maybe, said Shadow. Maybe she was lonely. Skipa is calling me out in the YouTube chat. Interesting accent work there, because the dwarves do have the same Scottish accent. Are you aiming for a northwestern accent there? Not entirely northwestern, more around the Black Isle, I should say, but it's a little tricky because Jenny doesn't have an entirely Scottish accent either. So I was going for something a little more generic there. But yes, I apologize that that accent wasn't quite as it should be for the Northwest. I'm afraid I can't quite muster my Grant O'Rourke, beautiful, mellifluous, island Scots for as is appropriate up there. So Jenny is, spoilers for later in the story, a Haldar. These are seductive forest creatures. These come from Scandinavian folklore, from Norway and from Sweden and from Finland, and they're kind of nature spirits, kind of dryads. They kind of have that connection to the forest, connection to the earth thing covered. The name Huldar actually is from a root word meaning secret. So these are secret spirits who masquerade as women, beautiful women. Always beautiful women. There is a male version of the Huldar called the, forgive my pronunciation here, the Huldrakal, but the Huldrakal are always horribly ugly and misshapen. They are more like trolls. But these beautiful, seductive women who come down out of the forests and marry farmers, this is a strong part of Scandinavian folklore, probably explicitly, Norse folklore at this point. You can track the roots of these myths all the way back to Norse culture and Norse myth, which presumably is where Jenny comes from. That presumably is her point of arrival. If we had a little Mr. Ibis narrated coming to Scotland segment in this short story, that's what it would read like. Vikings coming to this coast, bringing with them Odin and Tyr and Thor and Balder, but also bringing with them, well, Jenny. So that's the mythic foundation of Jenny's presence in the story. But what about the narrative foundation? What is she doing here? I feel like a Huldar. We begin actually with Shadow saying, so you like it here. And he has this tension. Shadow doesn't express a strong opinion about Cape Wrath. And if you've never been there, Cape Wrath is desolate. It is grim up there, you guys. I mean, it is a beautiful land, but it is a wild land, and comfort is rare to find. These little clustered houses, these little clustered villages tucked away in the lee of a hill, because the wind that is coming from, well, all directions simultaneously will cut you to the bone for about 10 months out of the year, and the other 2 months, the midgies will do the job for them. It is tough up there, let me tell you. Like I say, beautiful, but fairly inhospitable. But Shadow doesn't really express a strong opinion about it, and actually, if anything, seems to rather like it, seems to rather enjoy it. But here he's constantly confronted by people who are saying, no, this is terrible. This is the arsehole of nowhere. This is the worst place in the world. And Jenny's one of them. So you like it here. And she shakes her head and says, I feel like a holdout. And then she tells the story of the holdout. But why does Jenny feel like this? I mean, okay, spoilers. Yes, Jenny is this. But why does she feel like this? Well, there are two clues, I think, here. The first in the first part of the story and the second right here at the end. But sometimes the farmers do not run. Sometimes they throw a knife over her shoulder or just smile and they marry the Halder woman. Then her tail falls off, but she is still stronger than any human woman could ever be, and she still pines for her home in the forests and the mountains. She will never be truly happy. She will never be human. So that's it. So Jenny is here and torn between two worlds, really two truths of her existence. The first, perhaps, that she longs to be human. That's absolutely acceptable as a part of the Holder myth, by the way. They want to be human. That is why they come down and seduce farmers and marry them, because they want human lives. That's why their tail falls off when they get married. They want to be human. But Jenny isn't and can't be, because that's not actually how myths work in the frame of American gods. And then on the other hand, she longs for her forests, for her mountains, but these are not her forests and mountains. This is Scotland. This is not her home. The mountains that she pines for, if you'll forgive the pun, are in Norway, in Scandinavia. That's where she wants to be. So she's caught between these two worlds and is unable to reconcile them. And of course, Shadow is caught there too. This is a tragic thing for Shadow. You know, this is the curse of Shadow's existence, the tragedy of Shadow's existence. I don't actually think is overstating it at all. He is a man, has been a man for all of his life, except that, of course, he isn't. And he can't be. But he can't be a god either. He doesn't want to be, or he hasn't embraced that power, embraced that potential. He's still a man living a god's life, or a god living a man's life. He too is caught between two worlds. And then Jenny has this other question right here at the end when she tells the story of the Holder wife and the poker, bending the poker into a perfect circle like her wedding ring. And the farmer realizes she could have done this at any point. I will behave myself from now on. And she asks, well, okay, but if she could have done this at any point, brackets, I guess I'm reading between the lines here, but if I could have done this at any point, why did I let him beat me in the first place? And again, here we're seeing the effect of stories, the effect of belief, the effect of power, of the kind of narrative frameworks that go unquestioned, that go unchallenged in our everyday life. This is the story of a husband and wife, and it's the story of a wife who for a while forgot what she was, forgot what she was capable of, and didn't reassert herself until she was driven to remember. You know, things could have just been fairly bad in their marriage forever, and she would never have taken action. It was only when we get to the point of crisis that she actually takes action. She remembers herself, who she is, and then demonstrates who she is. And that's enough to secure peace, but it's not enough to undo the harm that was done. And Jenny, too, similarly, Shadow, too, similarly, is caught here. Not integrated, disintegrated, you know, fractured around the very core of their identity. This is not who either one of them really is. We'll continue to look at this as we move through the rest of the story. I'm sorry, I've depressed the YouTube chat. I do apologize. Becca says, now I want Scottish gods. That seems amazing. Yeah, except we've already got our aggregate mythology. We don't really need Neil Gaiman to come in and come up with another one. This does tell me, though, you know, I would love to do a series of podcasts on Scottish myth and Scottish fable to go really deep into them, because there are so many stories. And because, you know, countries as old as Scotland, countries that existed before any kind of modern transportation technology, you know, have tiny fragmented myths. You can literally, you know, drive along the northeast coast of Scotland and stop in every little town and village on the way, and you will hear different versions of the story, and you can track the evolution of those stories. You can see how, you know, like a game of telephone, from one village to the next, to the next, to the next, the story grows and adapts over time. And it's, oh, no, it isn't about that well 40 miles west of here. It's about the well in the next village. Of course it is. It's always been about that well. Why would we tell stories about the well 40 miles from here? That would be crazy. So yeah, it would be fascinating someday. All right, let's Danielle's asking, have any of you read Lord of Light? It's Roger Zelazny, and he also deals with the melding of mythos and, in his case, science fiction. I haven't read that, but that does sound fascinating. Good. Okay. Now I want to drive all over Scotland to hear myths, says Skipa. Okay, Skipa, Kickstarter goal, you and me in a car with a portable recorder will make this happen. It'll be like a 6-month road trip. It'll be great. Okay, let's push on to our next slide. And I'm skipping through these stories very quickly because we do have 2 stories to cover and I don't want to keep you here all night. Our second slide follows after Shadow has actually gone to the house where the mysterious party is taking place and he is introduced to Mr. Alice. I've heard a lot about you, said Mr. Alice. Been wanting to meet with you for a while. They said you were a smart young man who was going places. That's what they said. So you didn't just hire a tourist to keep the neighbors away from your party? Well, yes and no. We had a few other candidates, obviously. It's just you were perfect for the job. And when I realized who you were, well, a gift from the gods, really, weren't you? I don't know. Was I? Absolutely. You see, this party goes back a very long way. Almost 1,000 years they've been having it. Never missed a single year. And every year, there's a fight between our man and their man, and our man wins. This year, our man is you. Who, said Shadow, who are they? And who are you? I'm your host, said Mr. Alice. I suppose... He stopped for a moment, tapped his walking stick against the wooden floor. They're the ones who lost a long time ago. We won. We were the knights and they were the dragons. We were the giant killers and they were the ogres. We were the men and they were the monsters. And we won. They know their place now, and tonight is all about not letting them forget it. It's humanity you'll be fighting for tonight. We can't let them get the upper hand, not even a little us versus them. Dr. Gaskell said I was a monster, said Shadow. Dr. Gaskell, said Mr. Alice, friend of yours? No, said Shadow, he works for you, or for the people who work for you. I think he kills children and takes pictures of them. Mr. Alice dropped his walking stick. He bent down awkwardly to pick it up. Then he said, Oh, I don't think you're a monster, Shadow. I think you're a hero. No, thought Shadow. You think I'm a monster, but you think I'm your monster. But we'll skip right over the dream that Shadow has of Dr. Gaskell, in which he imagines, dreams, sees, prophesies the Doctor killing the children and taking their pictures, which is pretty dark and pretty disturbing and is definitely one of those elements that could be put to use in An American Gods 2. Just a note for the future. Mr. Alice, we should say, is he presents everything we know about American Gods, tells us that Mr. Alice should be a god, that Mr. Alice should be some mythic figure that we just have to recognize. We have to unpick the puzzle that is Mr. Alice. But the puzzle that is Mr. Alice is not mythological, it is literary. Mr. Alice actually appears in another character from the anthology in question, from the Fragile Things anthology. He appears in a story called Keepsakes and Treasures, in which he is described as one of the 10 richest men on Earth. So this is a bit of interweaving of Gaiman's own canon, if you like, more than it is another example of him pulling out an obscure god and allowing the reader to guess the identity. So we have monsters and we have heroes. We have the victors and we have the vanquished. And obviously, for those of us who have just read American Gods, we might be tempted to read this as another example of the false old god, new god dichotomy, that there isn't really a difference between the old gods and the new gods, save for the manufactured conflict put into play by Loki and by Odin. So we're already primed, I think, as we read this story to think, well, come on now. Heroes and monsters are not so very different. And Shadow absolutely pulls that out at the end. I think you're a hero. No, you think I'm a monster, but you think I'm your monster. And isn't the definition of a hero in this classical swashbuckling knight-errant slaying the dragon sense, isn't the definition of a hero our monster? The monster who fights for us? Certainly in the classical sense, that is true. Heroes, by definition, are exceptional, are outside of the bounds of society. If everyone could do what a hero could do, then it wouldn't be heroic. Think, for example, of one of the great heroes of modern pop culture, Superman. Superman exemplifies all of the great virtues that we, by consensus, have decided are worthy. He represents American values, truth, justice, and the American way, right? Superman represents things that we can all, I think, pretty unambiguously get behind. But he's an alien. He is different from us. And even if he wasn't actually literally an alien, he would still be unlike us. Heroes are created for the quest. They are not created for the world. Heroes can't live alongside ordinary people in fiction. It just can't happen because the reminder of the power disparity, if nothing else, makes it impossible for them to integrate. So heroes are, literally and technically speaking, monsters. And again, I'm differentiating. Hero is often used hero is used carelessly to mean protagonist. He's the hero of our story. He works in a coffee shop and has a man bun, this kind of thing. Those aren't the kinds of heroes that I'm talking about. I am talking about capital H hero in the mythic sense, in the classical sense. Great heroes like Hercules and Theseus and Perseus, heroes who like Conan the Barbarian, and like Superman, who exist outside of that cultural frame and who are great because they exist outside of that cultural frame. Heroes who are great by virtue of their greatness. They are innately and uniquely exceptional. So heroes can never integrate. Heroes can never be the good guy. They can never really, lead or build a culture or a community. They are always going to be outsiders. And we see this here. Let's call up the slide again. They are the ones who lost a long time ago. We won. We were the knights and they were the dragons. We were the giant killers. They were the ogres. We were the man and they were the monsters. And we won. And here, crucially, Mr. Alice is exactly right in his use of the word men. We were the men, not the heroes. Here he is identifying himself with those tools that were put to good use by these cultures and communities. We were the knights and they were the dragons. Well, no, you were the villagers, buddy. You were, the people supporting the knights, but you were not actually the knights. We were the giant killers. They were the ogres. Again, no, you had giant killers. You used giant killers, but you yourself are not a giant killer. We were the men. They were the monsters. Yes, that is true. And we won. They know their place now, and tonight is all about not letting them forget it. It's humanity you'll be fighting for tonight. Another emphasis there. Not the inhuman hero. It is the common man that you'll be fighting for tonight. We can't let them get the upper hand, not even a little. Us versus them. The exact nature of that conflict is fascinating, honestly. They were vanquished long ago. This is just, to remind them of who's in charge. We can't let them get the upper hand. What is the upper hand in this sense? What is the actual heart of this conflict? Well, as we're going to see later, the heart of the conflict is basically performative. It's basically, this is a feel-good ritual for everyone who is here. Yeah. Danielle's talking about a science fiction series of podcasts. I will email you, Danielle, when we are done here, or you can email me, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. We can talk about this. Yes, good. All right. So let's move on to the next slide and the summoning of the monster, who coincidentally we have already met. Then the guests arranged themselves around the edge of the courtyard and they began to beat the drums with the sticks. They started slow and they started quietly, a deep throbbing pounding like a heartbeat. Then they began to crash and slam into strange rhythms, staccato beats that wove and wound louder and louder until they filled Shadow's mind and his world. It seemed to him that the firelight flickered to the rhythms of the drums. And then from outside the house, the howling began. There was pain in the howling and anguish, and it echoed across the hills above the drum beats, a wail of pain and loss and hate. The figure that stumbled through the doorway to the courtyard was clutching its head, covering its ears as if to stop the pounding of the drum beats. The firelight caught it. It was huge now, bigger than Shadow and naked. It was perfectly hairless and dripping wet. It lowered its hands from its ears and it stared around, its face twisted into a mad grimace. "Stop it!" it screamed. "Stop making all that noise!" And the people in their pretty clothes beat the drums harder and faster, and the noise filled Shadow's head and chest. The monster stepped into the center of the courtyard. It looked at Shadow. "You," it said, I told you about the noise." And it howled, a deep, throaty howl of hatred and challenge. The creature edged closer to Shadow. It saw the knife and stopped. "Fight me," it shouted. "Fight me fair, not with cold iron, fight me."
I don't want to fight you, said Shadow. He dropped the knife on the grass, raised his hands to show them empty. Too late, said the bald thing that was not a man. Too late for that. And it launched itself at Shadow. So we previously met Grendel and Grendel's mother in the hotel dining room. I wish that I could gloss Beowulf right now. I wish that I could take, I don't know, an hour or 5 and talk about Beowulf, but I can't, so I'm going to restrict myself. If you've never read Beowulf, if you're unaware of Beowulf, it is basically one of the most important poems ever written. It is an epic Anglo-Saxon poem written between 700 and 1000 AD, or kind of revised and originated during that time. And Grendel is one of the antagonists, the monster of Beowulf. Basically, everyone is afraid of Grendel but Beowulf himself. And it's interesting that Gaiman gets away with his little illusion here, with his little trick, with his little, coin vanish that he does here in the narrative, because there isn't within the pages of Beowulf an actual clear account of Grendel's physical appearance. So the idea that he just appears as a bold hairless man, a completely hairless man who is averse to sound and to noise, is actually completely consistent. That works really quite beautifully. Grendel's mother, on the other hand, is not really going to appear in the proceedings, but she's still fascinating and every bit as mysterious, because when she is introduced, there is basically a 4-word sentence, and I'm not going to read this aloud because I will murder this sentiment. But basically, there is a 4-word phrase. The first 2 read Grendel's mother, and scholars agree on the meaning of Grendel's mother. The last 2 words, though, are very obscured, very, very strange, and no one really knows what they mean or what they represent. So the exact nature of Grendel's mother is somewhat confusing. I like the analysis that suggests that Grendel's mother is a warrior woman. That's what the translation of that 2-word phrase is. But Grendel's mother not really appearing in this narrative except for a veil, her appearance, obviously, but not appearing in this part of the narrative, save for a veiled threat at the end there. Yeah, I think there's a very good chance that I will do probably not a whole seminar series on Beowulf, though, of course, Professor Tolkien did write a translation of Beowulf and offered a great commentary on Beowulf. It was one of his most beloved poems in the world, and he spent a long time thinking and talking and writing about it. So that would give me a perspective on it that I would really value. But certainly a one-shot, I think, looking at Beowulf would be completely appropriate. Yeah. And Skipa calls out, does its aversion to cold iron mean Grendel is a fae? I mean, yes, in a sense. This is at a point in Anglo-Saxon mythology where basically all monsters are fae, all monsters, or at least there is no meaningful delineation between the realm of fairy and, kind of monsters of the mortal realm, as it were. Fairy is where monsters come from. All supernatural things are harmed by cold iron at this point in the evolution of Anglo-Saxon myth. Later, that will be revised and we'll start drawing distinctions because, we love our taxonomies. We love our, D&D monster manual approach to mythic creatures. So later that will become less urgent, but yes, it will start to separate, excuse me. So here we see Shadow being put to ill use. He doesn't want to fight Grendel. He doesn't want to kill this monster. He himself is being used as a monster. His humanity is being denied in this moment, and the fight, when it comes, is bloody. Shadow is in a great deal of trouble, but then he asks for help. Shadow whispered, "Jenny." There was no reply. Everything was happening so slowly. Another club was coming down, this one aimed at his hand. Shadow rolled out of the way awkwardly, watching the heavy wood smash into the turf. "Jenny," he said, picturing her too fair hair in his mind, her thin face, her smile. "I call you. Come now, please." A gust of cold wind. The dark-haired woman had raised her club high and brought it down now, fast, hard, aiming for Shadow's face. The blow never landed. A small hand caught the heavy stick as if it were a twig. Fair hair blew about her head in the cold wind. He could not have told you what she was wearing. She looked at him. Shadow thought that she looked disappointed. One of the men aimed a cudgel blow at the back of her head. It never connected. She turned, a rending sound as if something was tearing itself apart, and the bonfires exploded. That was how it seemed. There was blazing wood all over the courtyard, even in the house, and people were screaming in the bitter wind. Shadow staggered to his feet. So here, Jenny comes to rescue Shadow, another monster defending a monster in the face of a monster. This is, gosh, you guys, this is really tough. Kate is saying, we're talking about Old English. This is fantastic here in the YouTube chat. Skipa says, of course, Tolkien wrote a translation of Beowulf. It was around before 1500. Yes, of course. The professor's professed antipathy for modern texts, that is anything from the year 1500 onward, of course, Beowulf would be his jam. Yes. Danielle reads, let me see here if I can scroll back. I work 50 hours a week or more. I've read Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon. Wow, Danielle, that's incredible. And Homer in Greek? Good Lord. Becca says to Danielle, you may be my hero. The best I can do is Middle English, and that's not even a real second language. That's astonishing. Skipa can sing in 7 other languages. And Kate says, echoing my own voice here, dang, y'all are accomplished. My Arthurian tradition professor could speak in Old and Middle English. She actually did recordings for audiobooks. That's amazing. But I can only speak a little Spanish. Kate adds, muy poquito. Yes, I'm afraid my facility with languages is not what I wish that it were. Yes, yes, good. So here we are in the realm of monsters, but when monsters fight, men die. This is the oldest story. This is why men seek to control monsters, seek to defeat monsters, seek to exile monsters when they cannot themselves be slain. And then ultimately, through, in part, the accretion of myth, to build a framework that does not allow for monsters, that denies monsters belief. And we must remember that this is still American Gods. It feels as though Shadow has stepped into a different story, but this is still American Gods. Why is Grendel real? Well, because he was believed in. Why is Jenny real? Because she was believed in. These are still stories that spring forth from men, which gives us another layer of perspective here on this core conflict. That conflict that I mentioned earlier, the idea that heroes in the classical sense cannot exist integrated with society, that they are always exiles, that they are always outsiders, that is true within like classic mythology, within our understanding of the actual real world, you know, whether you populate it with, you know, the gods of Olympus or the gods of America. This is our understanding of how stories work. But given what we know about the universe of American Gods, the world of American Gods, that conceit is only true because those are the stories that are told. So there's a double layer of tragedy here, that monsters are only monsters because there isn't a better story. There isn't a more integrated or humane story. Grendel was a slave to his nature from the moment that he was created, whatever spark of creation it is that brings gods into existence, as is Jenny, as tragically is Shadow. This is part of what Shadow is going to be fighting for the rest of the story and onward. So, saved by Jenny, Shadow retreats. He passes out again, wakes up again. This is the classic Shadow structure that we've seen before, and then he agrees to leave Scotland. He definitely can't go near Grendel because Grendel's mother will be very upset. And now there's a long list of very powerful and influential people who would like to have a word with Mr. Shadow Moon about his failure to kill the monster. And of course, even here we're foreshadowing, right? This whole conflict between men and monsters, between heroes and monsters, God, that feels like a possible subject for American Gods too. That feels like something Gaiman would love to get his teeth into, because it feels as though we're highlighting a whole new kind of thematic template. Here, there is a thematic landscape that has just been revealed to us, and now we are ready to go exploring. It is compatible with the landscape that we had previously, but it's new enough that there are interesting adventures to be had, interesting stories to be told, interesting perspectives to be gained. So the whole man and monster conflict, that could be the foundation for American Gods too. Hey, Neil, if you're listening, email me. I have a pitch for you. Let's move on to the very end of this story, Monarch of the Glen. The train came to a complete stop. It was a small station seemingly in the middle of nowhere. There was a large black car parked by the station building in the thin sunshine. The windows were tinted, and Shadow could not see inside. Mr. Smith pushed down the train window, reached outside to open the carriage door, and he stepped out onto the platform. He looked back in at Shadow through the open window. Well, I think, said Shadow, that I'll spend a couple of weeks looking around the UK, and you'll just have to pray that I look the right way when I cross your roads. And then Shadow knew it then. Perhaps he had known it all along. Chicago, he said to Smith as the train gave a jerk and began to move away from the station. He felt older as he said it, but he could not put it off forever. And then he said so quietly that only he could have heard it, "I guess I'm going home." Soon afterward, it began to rain, huge pelting drops that rattled against the windows and blurred the world into grays and greens. Deep rumbles of thunder accompanied Shadow on his journey south. The storm grumbled, the wind howled, and the lightning made huge shadows across the sky. And in their company, Shadow slowly began to feel less alone. This is gorgeous. This is just gorgeous. I love the evocation of the storm there, and its obvious, familial connection to Shadow. In the storm, in the midst of the storm, he begins to feel less alone. And now he has decided that he is going to go home, but not yet. Because we have to talk about Black Dog, and we're moving on to Trigger Warning. This is another anthology of Gaiman's fiction, this one published in 2015. This is actually a very recent anthology. It contains the story Black Dog, in which Shadow is traveling in England. It isn't at all clear how much time has passed between the stories, but boy howdy, it isn't much. It's presumably taking place within the next couple of weeks after Monarch of the Glen here. The Black Dog is a metaphor for depression, though, of course, in Neil Gaiman's skilled hands, that's not all it is. He manages to merge this very common metaphor with a metaphor for depression with this magical realist spin, which works quite beautifully. But I think it is fair to say that Black Dog feels much less like American Gods than any of his other stories. You pretty much could have filed off the serial numbers and made this a generic fantasy horror story. It doesn't necessarily need to be an American God story in quite the way that Monarch of the Glen does. The Black Dog, by the way, as a metaphor, was made famous by Winston Churchill, of course, who struggled with terrible depression throughout his life and would speak of the Black Dog in exactly those terms. But it's much older than that. It actually entered English thanks to Samuel Johnson in the 18th century, but the phrase Black Dog is associated with depression and melancholy in the works of Horace and Apollonius, two classical Roman poets. So basically, for as long as people have been writing things down, there has been an association between black dogs and depression. We should also note that dogs are not the only animal featured in this story. We get a return of Bast, as well as some more of that obscure dream imagery. Let's move on to our first slide of Black Dog. The room next door was better lit, larger, and it felt a little less like somebody's front room. People were sitting at tables eating. The food looked good and smelled better. The landlord led Shadow to the back of the room to a dusty glass case. "There she is," said the landlord proudly. The cat was brown, and it looked at first glance as if it had been constructed out of tendons and agony. The holes that were its eyes were filled with anger and with pain. The mouth was wide open, as if the creature had been yowling when she returned to leather. "The practice of placing animals in the walls of buildings is similar to the practice of walling up children alive in the foundations of a house you want to stay up," explained the mutton-chop man from behind him. "Though mummified cats always make me think of the mummified cats they found around the temple of Bast in Bubastis in Egypt. So many tons of mummified cats, they sent them to England to be ground up as a cheap fertilizer and dumped on the fields. The Victorians also made paint out of mummies, sort of brown, I believe." "It looks miserable," said Shadow. "How old is it?" The landlord scratched his cheek. "We reckon that the wall she was in went up somewhere between 1300 and 1600. That's from parish records. There's nothing here in 1300. There's a house in 1600. The stuff in the middle was lost." So we get our introduction to a couple of important themes. Cats and dogs, of course, represented throughout this story, but also the walling up of children, of animals, as a means of preserving the sanctity of the building. And it may take us a moment, and you may have to squint just a little to see this connection, this thread, past the obvious walling up, of course. But the purpose of the walling up is a little more obscure here. Yes, Skip is saying, as soon as he mentioned Bast, I expected to see her. I wasn't disappointed. I don't love specifically calling out Bast here. I feel as though you could have done this from the temple in Bubastis, or from temples in Bubastis in Egypt. I think would have been obscure enough that it would have worked as an Easter egg or as a reward for the reader more schooled in Egyptian myth. But certainly it's very, very good, and I was very, very glad to see Bast show up too. So this is our framework here. What is the purpose of walling up creatures in walls? Well, why do we do this? It's as a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice not to a god in this sense, not as it was back in ancient Egypt, but it is a sacrifice to the building itself. We want the building to stand. We want it to endure, so we make the necessary sacrifice. And we'll see how that works out when we get to the story of Moira and Oliver. This is, by the way, one of my favorite passages that Gaiman has ever written. This is, for me, sufficient justification for the whole Black Dog story. And I know it sounds as though I don't like the Black Dog story because I was just very critical about it as a piece of American Gods, arcana. I really like this story. It's less essential to American Gods, and American Gods is less essential to it than anything we've seen so far. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a knockout story. I completely adore it. These were the things Shadow learned that night, sitting around the kitchen table with Moira and Oliver. He learned that Oliver had not been happy or fulfilled in his London advertising agency job. He had moved up to the village and taken an extremely early medical retirement. Now, initially for recreation and increasingly for money, he repaired and rebuilt dry stone walls. There was, he explained, an art and a skill to wall building. It was an excellent exercise and, when done correctly, a meditative practice. There used to be hundreds of dry stone wall people around here. Now there's barely a dozen who know what they're doing. You see walls repaired with concrete or with breeze blocks. It's a dying art. I'd love to show you how I do it. Useful skill to have. Picking the rock, sometimes you have to let the rock tell you where it goes. And then it's immovable. You could knock it down with a tank. Remarkable. He learned that Oliver had been very depressed several years earlier, shortly after Moira and he got together, and for the last few years he had been doing very well, or, he amended, relatively well. He learned that Moira was independently wealthy, that her family trust fund meant that she and her sisters had not needed to work, but that in her late 20s she had gone for teacher training, that she no longer taught, that she was extremely active in local affairs and had campaigned successfully to keep the local bus routes in service. Shadow learned from what Oliver didn't say that Oliver was scared of something, very scared, and that when Oliver was asked what had frightened him so badly and what he had meant by saying that the Black Dog had followed him home, his response was to stammer and to sway. He learned not to ask Oliver any more questions. This is what Oliver and Moira had learned about Shadow sitting around that kitchen table. Nothing much. I completely love this passage from its first to its last. I adore it. And it feels like two profound influences to me. It feels like Mr. Ibis, but far more even than that, it feels like Jim Dale from Pushing Daisies, which is a strong thread for me right now in my life. I have been watching the Brian Fuller show, Pushing Daisies, the magical realist mystery romance show, Pushing Daisies, which is just delightful. I recommend it for everyone, though it is a little tough to get a hold of these days. I have been watching that, and it's lovely. That show is narrated with extraordinary, beautiful, clinical precision by the beloved Jim Dale, and he sounds not unlike this. It's really very, very good indeed. That she no longer taught, that she was extremely active in local affairs and had campaigned successfully to keep the local bus routes in service. And then, of course, our capper here, coming back down to our flat, Gaiman perspective on Shadow. This is what Oliver and Moira had learned about Shadow sitting around that kitchen table. Obviously, we're echoing that first line. It's beautifully done. Nothing much. Shadow has learned a great deal. They have learned almost nothing. So here is the story. This is what happens here. Yes, the rock wall bit is fascinating, says Becca. There are examples from across the globe. It really is a dying art. It absolutely is. I used to know someone in Scotland who built dry stone walls, and it is gorgeous to watch, if nothing else. It's a real art form. It's just lovely. I'm sure you can find YouTube videos of the whole process. It's really impressive. So here is the story. Moira and Oliver were both involved in other relationships when they met, and they fell in love. Now, Oliver is haunted by the specter of the Black Dog, and also by an odd, crippling, narcoleptic depression. Shadow goes walking. Obviously, we're skimming over this. I only have 4 slides for this entire story. So here we are, penultimate slide here in tonight's session. Shadow goes walking and meets the mysterious Cassie on the hill by the gate to hell. "Are you going to try to kiss me?" she asked. He said. Then, honestly, it hadn't occurred to me. "Well," she said, turning to smile at him, "it bloody well should. I mean, I asked you up here, and you came up to Wode's Hill just to see me." She went back to the paper and the drawing of the hill. "They say there's dark doings been done on this hill. Dirty, dark doings. And I was thinking of doing something dirty myself. To Moira's lodger." "Is this some kind of revenge plot?" "It's not an anything plot. I just like you. And there's no one around here who wants me any longer. Not as a woman." The last woman that Shadow had kissed had been in Scotland. He thought of her and what she had become in the end. "You are real, aren't you?" he asked. "I mean, you're a real person. I mean," she put the pad of paper down on the boulder and she stood up. Kiss me and find out, she said. He hesitated. She sighed, and she kissed him. It was cold on that hillside, and Cassie's lips were cold. Her mouth was very soft. As her tongue touched his, Shadow pulled back. I don't actually know you, Shadow said. She leaned away from him, looked up into his face. You know, she said, all I dream of these days is somebody who will look my way and see the real me. I'd given up until you came along, Mr. American, with your funny name. But you looked at me, and I knew you saw me. And that's all that matters.
Skipa said, I totally missed Wode's Hill as a reference to Dear Old Dad. Yes, Wode's Hill, Woden's Hill, Odin's Hill. That's how that works etymologically. This is kind of heartbreaking and is another bit of Gaiman's very skillful misdirection. Because everything that Cassie says works if she were a woman. Spoilers, Cassie's not a woman. As Skipa says in the chat, someday Shadow's going to get some loving from a real living woman, but not today. No, not this day. Cassie is, of course, dead. Cassie was killed by Oliver. Oliver walled her up in the cave. He built her into the wall, as it were, as a sacrifice. And what do we sacrifice things to? What is he trying to preserve here? He's trying to build the structure of his relationship with Moira. He wants that metaphorical house to stand. So he removes the obstacle. They tell everyone, or he tells everyone, that Cassie moved away to London and was never seen again. So it becomes wildly inappropriate when Shadow brings up having seen Cassie. Doesn't, thankfully, mention having kissed Cassie. And of course, Cassie has already been introduced to us within the frame of the fiction back in the pub in the opening movement of the story. So this is a very nicely constructed little mystery. It does rely on she was dead the whole time, which is maybe a bit of a trite turn now, kind of a cliched plot twist now, but I think that Gaiman manages to pull it off really rather beautifully. And for some reason in this story, I am constantly reminded, not of Sherlock Holmes, which is the obvious association. I mean, we even reference Sherlock Holmes directly here. We reference the Hound of the Baskervilles in the frame of this story, but oddly, there's something very Doctor Who about this story that I like quite a lot, though in fairness, Doctor Who probably wouldn't end with a woman having been murdered and stuffed into a wall and then bricked up with dry stone walling, which is, you know, a very British way to die, at least. Let's wrap up here with the reveal and with the return of Bast. Ollie, said Shadow, the beast is going to kill you. It's already inside you. It's not a good thing. Old Shuck's not going to hurt me. Old Shuck loves me. Cassie's in the wall, said Oliver, and he dropped a rock on top of the others with a crash. Now you're in the wall with her. Nobody's waiting for you. Nobody's going to come looking for you. Nobody's going to cry for you. Nobody's going to miss you. There were, Shadow knew, although he could never have told a soul how he knew, 3 of them, not 2 in that tiny space. There was Cassie Burglas, there in body, rotted and dried and still stinking of decay, and there in soul, there was also something else, something that twined about his legs and then butted gently at his injured hand. A voice spoke to him from somewhere close. He knew that voice, though the accent was unfamiliar. It was the voice that a cat would speak in if a cat were a woman. Expressive, dark, musical. The voice said, "You should not be here, Shadow. You have to stop and you must take action. You are letting the rest of the world make your decisions for you." Shadow said aloud, "That's not entirely fair, Bast." "You have to be quiet," said Oliver, gently. "I mean it." The stones of the wall were being replaced rapidly and efficiently. Already they were up to Shadow's chest. No? Sweet thing, you really have no idea. No idea who you are or what that means. If he walls you up in here to die in this hill, the temple will stand forever, and whatever hodgepodge of belief these locals have will work for them and will make magic. But the sun will still go down on them, and all the skies will be gray. All things will mourn, and they will not know what they are mourning for. The world will be worse. For people, for cats, for the remembered, for the forgotten. You have died and you have returned. You matter, Shadow. And you must not meet your death here, a sad sacrifice hidden in a hillside. "So what are you suggesting I do?" he whispered. "Fight. The beast is a thing of mind. It's taking its power from you, Shadow. You are near, and so it's become more real. Real enough to own Oliver. Real enough to hurt you." The most suggestive line in the entire story, and again, a potential hook for American Gods too. The beast is a thing of mind. It's taking its power from you, Shadow. You are near, and so it's become more real. Real enough to own Oliver. Real enough to hurt you. What is Shadow?
How is Shadow capable of, even by his presence, making the beast, the dog, more real? And what happens if Shadow dies? If he walls you up in here and you die in this hill, the temple will stand forever, and whatever hodgepodge I believe these locals have will work for them and will make magic. Oh, son, you are a battery. You are just a big belief battery, and you are full right now. And if you are walled up in here, then whatever happens to be believed about this hill will be true, because you are the focal point of this belief. You will make it happen. You will make it real. But the sun will still go down on them, and all the skies will be gray. They will mourn. The sun will set and not arise again. The association we discussed last time between Balder and the sun. So now Balder, Shadow, has a duty to fulfill. And Skipa says, well, he died and came back, so that makes him demi-immortal? That's an interesting question. We don't have enough information to speculate exactly about the role that Shadow has to play or the nature of his life, if life is the right word. But we do know that Bast is explicit about his identity, about his choices, about his role. He's letting the world decide for him, and he is not doing it himself. So he does. It's a really tight little story. I enjoy it a great deal. The reveal is absolutely creepy. And I love the way that the black dog, the spectral hound that haunts Oliver, is actually brilliantly representative of depression. I didn't pull it as a slide, but right before Shadow was walled up, the influence of the black dog is enormously powerful. Shadow feels a fear and a fatalism that isn't actually a part of his makeup at all. We've never seen Shadow this afraid. We've never seen Shadow this defeated, not even when he asks for, eternal nothingness, not even when he is so done with life that he just wants oblivion. We've never seen him quite like this. So the manifestation of depression in the black dog, and the black dog as, a kind of a malevolent force, but also a force that is bound by its own myths and understandings. This is really skillful work. This is Gaiman taking, 3 different overlaying narratives, 3 different versions of this story, and making them work together in harmony. It's really beautifully done. It is a great and compelling little short story, and yes, contains these tantalizing little hooks for the future of Shadow Moon. That is it, but Black Dog was only published in 2015, so there's still hope. I'm not at all unconvinced that we will see at least another short story, possibly a novella, possibly a full novel about Shadow Moon within the space of the next 2 years. As Skipa says, this description of depression felt very, very real to my own experiences, a force that makes no sense and yet feels so real, taking over my mind. Yes, that moment when Shadow is absolutely conscious that, oh, this is the dog that's doing this to me. This isn't real, but he can't shake it. He can't lift himself out of it. Something is being done to his psychology. Something is being done to his spirit against his will. And that's incredibly hard. Depression is, no joke, you guys. And I think that it's beautifully represented in the span of this story. So I hope that you enjoyed reading those stories with me. That, I think, is going to do it for Storms on the Way. We're going to keep up the Discord channel. If you're a Patreon supporter, you can head on over to our Discord channel and chat a little more about American Gods there. I'm probably going to watch the TV show again within the next couple of months and kind of give my more considered verdict, particularly on the first couple of episodes in the context of the season as a whole, though logically that may have to wait until Outlander is done sometime around December, I suppose. So we'll see how that shakes out. But yes, there will be more American Gods discussion, and thank you all so much for being here with me for Storms on the Way. This was a project that I've been really looking forward to for the longest time, and then it came together all at the last minute because of the announcement of the TV show schedule. And I'm just thrilled to have had this opportunity to look through this fascinating and challenging and rich book with all of you. My understanding of and my personal appreciation of American Gods has honestly never been higher. I've had a blast discussing this book with all of you. So thank you to everyone who made it to the live sessions, to everyone who downloaded the podcast, to everyone who listened to my discussions with Daphne and Elizabeth, to Daphne and Elizabeth, of course. Thank you so much for all the conversations that we had. It has been an absolute blast. This is not the end of Storms on the Way, but this is the beginning of a long hiatus. I'll be back sometime in the future. In the meantime, though, there are other projects taking place over at pointnorthmedia.com, most notably occupying the Storms on the Way slot the third season of my series, Dear Mr. Potter. Next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, I'm going to start talking about Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, my favorite Harry Potter book. I cannot wait. We're covering the first 2 chapters for that session. And like all the other Point North Live sessions, we're going to alternate between afternoon sessions and evening sessions, schedule permitting. We'll do the best that we can, but we are going to bounce around between 3 p.m. Eastern and 9 p.m. Eastern. Those are the 2 usual broadcast times. So stay tuned to pointnorthmedia.com for more information. You can go on over to pointnorthmedia.com, sign up for the newsletter. You can click on the podcast button and find the entire live production schedule right there. And you can, of course, if you would like more of this, if you would like me to do an extended series looking at Beowulf, head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia and pledge your support. Everything that I do here at Point North is made possible by you and your support. I don't run ads on these podcasts. I don't run ads on the website. It's all you. You guys fund this thing and make it possible, and I am enormously grateful. This has been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. I will talk to you all again very soon. Thanks so much for being here, and take care.